Dear students, now today is our second lecture of psycholinguistics. In the previous lecture we discussed the introductions of sociolinguistics, psycholinguistics. Now if we further want to, we didn't complete psycholinguistics in the previous lecture, so we are going to follow that up and continue with it. Now in this lecture we are going to be discussing the principles of sentence through psycholinguistics. So, certain principles of sentence processing that were formulated at that time are still valid. When we were talking about the previous times, at that time, there were some principles that are still valid in nowadays. One of them, namely the principle of minimal attachment, means that when processing a sentence which could have multiple meanings, people most frequently tend to choose the simplest meaning. So, when we are processing, that means when we are trying to understand a sentence, at that point many people would opt for choosing the simplest meaning instead of going into complicated, or the meaning that in syntactic analysis would present the simplest parse tree with fewest nodes. Now parse tree is basically an example. It's a kind of a tree that has a lot of nodes or branches. So what they want to explain by this is that in the syntactic analysis that maybe a tree with lots of branches would be a suitable example that we would choose. There are so many meanings that we can take from one word. Thus a sentence, Mary watched. Now this is an example that if we would say that Mary watched the man with the binoculars. Now, by most language users would be interpreted that it was Mary, not the man who was using binoculars. So in this one sentence we can understand so many different meanings. Everybody has their own perception of understanding language. So however your brain processes it, that's how you're going to understand. So Mary watched the man with the binoculars. Now in this we can derive the meaning that either Mary was watching with the binoculars or the man had the binoculars and Mary was watching him. So there are two different concepts that two different people can perceive or understand. Now one other principle worth noting is the principle of late closure, which states that there is a tendency to join a new information to the current phrase or clause. So the second principle would be of late closure. Now sometimes we would like to join new information with a previous sentence or a clause which explains why in a sentence, such as John said he will leave this morning. Now in this sentence the phrase this morning would be understood as relating to the verb leave and not to the word said. Now, other psycholinguistic investigations, when we are processing the text in psycholinguistics, other psycholinguistic investigations into how processing of text occurs led to conclusion that complex sentences with multiple clauses are interpreted faster and with less mental effort when the clauses are not reduced. So, what we investigated is that the conclusion would be that complex sentences or multiple sentences. Now complex sentence would be difficult sentences, or multiple clauses means that when you have too many parts in a sentence, they are interpreted faster. They are understood faster and less mental effort when the clauses are not reduced. So the more the clauses, the less effort we have to put mentally, and we can understand a sentence easily. Now when it comes to speech, the experiments show that the interpretation of sentences can vary depending on the placing of pauses or disfluencies. So now that was when we're speaking, we experiment that trying to understand a sentence can depend on how we place the pauses or disfluencies, or like how I would take a breath. Like if I want to put emphasis on a single sentence, I would take a slight pause after that. I would raise my voice to that level and then take a slight pause. When I want to point out something, once again I would take a pause. So that would be a good example for this. So additionally, it has been proven that visual contact between speakers also has a strong influence on the ease or difficulty of processing text. So visual contact between speakers, when we are looking at each other, when we communicate with another person, like reading the facial expressions also matters a lot. It helps us understanding. So if a person is saying something in, let's say it's an angry text, but saying it in a smiling face, with a smiling face, now that could either be taunting or that could either be taken as a joke. So it also has a strong influence on us and or on difficulty of understanding the text. Now during experiments, subjects were listening to some sentences. Now many scientists have conducted different experiments regarded to psycholinguistics, and during some of those experiments subjects were listening. Subjects are those people who are who the tests or experiments are being conducted on. So they were listening to some sentences, and those who saw the speaker could understand what the speech was about better, while those who did not see him often had difficulties with it. So what we would perceive from this is that if you are seeing the speaker while the person is speaking, it's easier to understand what they are trying to say, instead of just listening to them. Now that would be a very good example, like for our recordings also. Like if now that you are seeing me on the screen, you can see how what words I'm putting emphasis on, and my facial expressions, and where I take pauses. But if you had just had to listen to me and you couldn't see me, then maybe it would be more difficult for you to concentrate. So the recent tendencies in psycholinguistics show increasing interest in discourse processing, and in particular in the way readers create a mental representation of the narrative word. So most of the psycholinguistics, they would like say that way a person would read a text would make a difference also. And the way they would then make a representation of the narrative word. The focus of interest is on the role of readers, schemata, and the problem of inferences. Now schemata means to plan or scheme something, and inferences means conclusion or deduction. When you come to a conclusion or you deduct something, you say, like for example, you have to deduct a cause or a fault in speech, or so on and so forth. So the focus of interest would be on the role of the readers, by the way they are planning or scheming, and the problem of the conclusion or deduction about the read subject matter. So whatever was read to you about that subject matter. Psycholinguistics has been proved that certain inferences are made in the very process of reading, while others are made later in order to resolve some problems or inconsistencies. So most of the time we would say that certain inferences or certain references would be made in the very process of the reading, and maybe later on other people would, in order to resolve some of the meanings or the problems or inconsistencies, they would once again refer to it. Now the issue of background knowledge and automaticity of drawing inferences are still being investigated. So we still haven't gotten the conclusion for that. There are so many researchers who are still investigating that. The ideas of sociolinguistic interest flourished primarily in Europe in the early 1960s, and then in America in 1987. Now this is a brief background or history of an overview of the psycholinguistics and how it started. So how the idea or the interest first started was, like I told you previously in the previous lecture, that in the 1960s. But then it moved on in 1987 to the US. Now, the first overview of psycholinguistics appeared in Annual Review of Psychology. So they had a first overview of psycholinguistics in the Annual Review of Psychology, which is a journal, by Rubinstein and Abron, two people, in 1960. Now, in 1964, George A. Miller, through his writings and experiments, bridged the gap between linguistic theory and psychological experimentation. Now, in the start, both of these things were dealt separately. Like I had discussed before, that the psychology of language was what we used to study previously, long ago, ages ago. But now, in 1964, George A. Miller, he conducted many experiments and wrote a lot of papers regarded to this field. And the difference or the gap that they had between linguistics and psychological experimentation was brought closer. And in a way, I think that's how they formed psycholinguistics. So in 1964, it was completely accepted by M. Neal. So in the same year, when they bridged that gap, it was accepted by M. Neal. In the early stage, psycholinguistics covered an extremely broad area, from acoustic phonetics to language pathology. Now, but gradually, it converged to a certain area of language and linguistic theory. So in the start, long ago, it was very broad. You could discuss so many topics within psycholinguistics, like the phonetics and language pathology. But now, while the time has passed, it's more certain and more converged or combined, we would call it, into language and the linguistic theory. Now, psycholinguistics is confined to the interrelationship of psychological and linguistic behavior. So what would we say that psycholinguistics is? Psycholinguistics is basically, it's the interrelationship of psychological and linguistic behavior, how people speak and how they think and perceive the language. जिस तरह उनको language समझ आती है और जिस तरह वो language बोलते हैं. So it studies how the mind processes and produces language. ये भी स्टडी करता है कि माइंड आपका लैंग्वेज को प्रोसेस कैसे करता है और उसको प्रोड्यूस कैसे करता है. Now process would be how you would develop language or sentences or thoughts that you would put into words, and then how you would produce the language. And by producing it means how you deliver it. It uses linguistic concepts to describe the mental processes connected with the acquisition and use of languages. So basically it's discussing the concepts. There are so many mental processes connected with linguistic concepts, but the basics ones are acquisition and use of language. So how we acquire the language and how we use the language. Now psycholinguistics deals with the various aspects of meaning. So with all of these, I think psycholinguistics would deal with the aspects of meaning, means that it will help you understand. So it has been deeply influenced by the development of generative theory, and its most important area of investigation has been language acquisition. So it has been influenced by generative theory, but also the way we acquire language. So the most important area of investigation would be how we acquire language. So the relationship between psychology and language cannot be ignored. Linguistic science is directly connected with the mind and psychological behavior. So relation between psychology, we can't ignore it because we only speak what we think. We have to process the words and the thoughts in our mind before we can put it into language. So even though now linguistic science is directly connected with the mind and psychological behavior, so that proves that in linguistic science that it's directly connected with your mind and your psychological behavior and the way you would behave psychologically. The linguistic expression of a man depends many times on the mental states such as love, anger, hatred, surprise, distress, all have a deep impact on language. Now, how would we go about explaining that? Is that the way a man would express in language his mental state. Now, if he is such as, like, if you love somebody, then you would express your words in a very loving way. In anger, your words would be very harsh and very cruel. In hatred, once again, your words would be harsh. Surprise, you could show surprise through your language. The expressions that we use, like, ah, that happened, or oh, I'm so surprised, or oh, that is great to know. Now, all of these are expressions of surprise. Distress would be when we are under a lot of stress. So we have a different way of putting words and expressing. So we can express all of these emotions through our language or through our words. Now, sometimes the language, especially speech, loses its control, which means the mental state is expressed through thought. So sometimes in language, especially in speech, like when we are speaking, sometimes we would lose control, or we would like stop in between. Like, I'm going to say something and I would just take a break and stop because I had maybe forgotten what I was going to say ahead. Now that would be mental state which I am expressing through my language. Now if I have stopped, that means that I am either confused or I am tense and I forgot what I was going to say. So you yourself must have been going through this many times also, that most of the time when we want to say something, we are not able to. We are thinking that we want to say that word, but we can't find words to express those feelings. That could be in happiness, that could be in anger, that could be in distress. Now, particularly, semantics is totally dependent on psychology. So semantics also is a part of linguistics, and it is totally dependent on psychology. Now, psychology also assists in forming the syntax of language, the words, the structure. So psychology also will assist us in forming the structure of a language. On some occasions, to know the reason for phonological changes, we have to take the help of psychology. So most of the time, when we want to see why there are changes, then we take the help of psychology to understand that. Now, the origin and growth of a language is also direct or indirect areas of psychology. So the origin and the growth of language, how the language grows or how it started, is also a direct or indirect areas of psychology. So it also studies child psychology of mentally retarded people. Now, when we are talking about psychology, then obviously the first experiments were conducted on children and how they reacted to certain situations. So even children that are mentally retarded means kids who are mentally not as alert or able as a normal child would be. The psychological treatment of the mentally diseased also depends on specific types of speech. So during treatment also, when we are psychologically giving them treatment for the mentally diseased, that means the mentally ill, it also depends on the specific type of speech that we use. There are so many examples for that, like when we want to, let's say, treat somebody's mental disorders, we most of the time would use hypnosis. Hypnosis would be when you're you're hypnotizing somebody. So in that point we also use, there is a specific type of speech that we would use to hypnotize somebody. So all of that also depends on our language and the way we use it. Now, language is a mental phenomenon. Whatever we think is expressed in language behavior. So our thoughts are basically expressed through our language. Like whatever we feel, we express by language. Psycholinguistics studies these mental processes such as thought and concept formation. So psycholinguistics is basically a study that would relate to the mental processes, how mentally how we process thoughts, and how we form the concepts of language. So the concept of psycholinguistics was developed in the early 60s. Like I told you before, that it started in the early 60s. In the beginning, it had covered a very broad area. So, like we discussed before, acoustic phonetics and language pathology, but now it's been confined to areas of linguistic theory, and then tend to be concentrated on the psycholinguist. So now, after all of that, then they are trying to concentrate on psycholinguist. Now, it has been mostly influenced by the generative theory and the so-called mentalists. We can see, now mentalists are those people who have generated different theories also, and mostly it's influenced by the generative theory. Now we can see examples of psycholinguistics in the infants, such as how they acquire language from their mother through the method of imitation, and how by imitating, learning and asking questions they grow. So a child, जिस तरह बच्चा सीखता है language, same way. Our elders also, when we are trying to learn a new language, we would go through the same steps. But the best example for psycholinguistics would be through infants. Now, how a child, when he is born and he starts growing up, at home you see that before he's even old enough to join a school, he starts learning the language from his mother at home. And how does he learn that language? The parents keep repeating words in front of a child. Let's say, for example, if the mother wants to teach the child how to say the word mama, she would keep on repeating that word to the child. Now what the child would do is imitate it. He would imitate, he would listen, he could hear the mother saying that word, and he would imitate that word, and by imitating he is learning that word. So that would be the first step in learning language. And then later on, when you teach him different things like this is a box or a pencil or a cup, these words, when we go through that, then a child would start asking questions. Now what is this? What is this used for? You would see that in your own brothers and sisters, maybe at home also, or younger children in the family, that they always tend to ask a lot of questions. Now when they're asking questions, basically that is their learning process. They are learning and imitating different words, and they are learning the language that the elders speak. Now it also studies the influence of psychological factors such as intelligence, motivation, and anxiety on the kind of language that is understood and produced. So psycholinguistics also studies the factors of intelligence and motivation, how we would be motivated to do something, and anxiety on kind of language that is understood or produced, that we can understand in understanding the language and producing the language. Now various language activities of a man are included in it. So there are so many varieties and so many activities in language that a man uses. They are also included. Now if a speaker makes any error in his language, it may be due to psychological reasons that influence its comprehension or production. Now what is comprehension? Comprehension is understanding the language. Influence would be how we make a difference on it or how it affects the situation. Production would be how we produce the language. So if a speaker makes any error while speaking or in any language, then that could be due to psychological reasons. So maybe he's having difficulty in understanding or maybe producing the language. Now, our perception of sounds and graphic symbols, like I had told you before, that sounds and graphic symbols in writing is influenced by the state of our mind. So how we write, or the perception of sounds, how we understand the sounds, and how we would write them down or draw them down would be influenced by our state of mind. Like, for example, if I'm in a happy mood, I would be, let's say if I'm drawing something on a paper, and for example I'm just sitting there doodling on a paper, I would make a happy face. Now that would be showing the state of my mind that I am happy. The learning of a language, the way the speaker uses it, the way of answering questions and of teaching it are included in the area of psycholinguistics. So psycholinguistics also covers these areas in which, like for example, how we would teach a language, or how teachers use it to explain to the students, or how a speaker uses it, or in a way of anybody answering any sort of question put to you. So all of those things are studied under psycholinguistics. One of the important aspects of psycholinguistics is the investigation of the acquisition of language by children. So first of all, an important aspect of psycholinguistics would be how children acquire language, or how they get language, how they learn it. So it also deals with the acquisition of language by hearing impaired. Hearing impaired means kids or people who can not hear properly. Maybe they can speak, but they can't hear. So how they acquire the language, even though they can't hear properly. Now the difference between language acquisition and language learning will also be one of the subjects of this area. So in psycholinguistics, the other subject would be the differences. We would be studying the differences of language acquisition and language learning. Now how we acquire language and how we learn the language. Language is the chief source of the psychological representation of mind. So basically how we represent whatever we are thinking, that's how our mind would represent those, and we would turn it into language, and it would be its chief source. Now the best way to express our thoughts is through speech. Now thinking distinguishes a human being from other animals. Now that's why we say that even in our religion, like we are called Ashraful Makhluqat, that means that we are more superior to the other animals that God has created. So the reason why, because animals have not been given such a vast way of thinking. The brain, the human brain is very complex, and according to researchers, we've just used a small portion of that brain yet. But if you see, according to the technologies nowadays, human beings have really used that part of their brain, and they have come up with so many technologies and so many things that make us so much superior from any other living being on earth. So it makes a man rational, which is a special gift provided to man by nature. So makes him rational means that would make him reasonable or understanding, and that is understanding each other or understanding one's problems or situations. That would be a special gift, and that is by nature we get that. Some people get it by nature, some people are a little bit more understanding than any other. So that's something that we naturally are gifted with. Now it is here that man is superior to other animals. So by this concept, we would say that man would be superior to other animals. Now, even among human beings, there we can differentiate that. Those who can think and reason better are more successful than others. So people whose mind works better, or who can use their logical thoughts and transfer it into language properly, and they, with better reason also, they would be more successful than the people who cannot express themselves well. So all it boils down to the thought that it's not only creating the language, but expressing the language also. Now, thinking is a mental process which refers to thought which springs from the mind. So it's a mental process also, and it refers to the thought which springs from the mind. Like whatever comes to our mind, we create it into a process, a mental process, and then we transfer it into speech and deliver it. Now, thinking is always processed and expressed in the native language. So most of the time, or L1, that's the first, your native language. Native language would be your language of birth. Let's say, for example, like in Pakistan, your native language would be Urdu. So the first time when you are processing or thinking of something, the first concept would be that you would start thinking in Urdu, and then you would express it. It would be more easy for you. Now, we have this problem with students also, that most of the time they have difficulty in forming proper grammatical rules in English also. Now, the basic reason for that is that it's very related to this, that the study in psycholinguistics, when we study this, that the thinking process. Now, we usually students would, in Pakistan, they would think in Urdu and then translate it into English and deliver it through speech. Now, when they are speaking, that means that they have taught the word in the grammatical rules of Urdu and then spoken it in English. So that's how your English gets bad. So because there are different grammatical rules for both the languages. So if you would start thinking in English, then it would be more easy for you to express yourself in that language also. The evocation and expression of thought depends on its quality. So the quality is that if you are confused, then you might not be able to express yourself so easily or so perfectly. But if you are relaxed, then you can express whatever thoughts are coming to your mind, you can express them. And it wouldn't be difficult. So thinking may be classified into many types, now such as reverie, association, reasoning, imagination, and daydreaming. So associating something with something, reasoning, trying to find logic in a thought, like we would say that, okay, if such and such happens, then what would be the consequences for that? So reverie, association, reasoning, imagination, and daydreaming. So daydreaming would be when we are awake but we are lost in our thoughts. So that also is, we can conclude that into a type of thinking. So imagination, how we use our imagination, that is also comes under thinking. Reverie, how we would suppose something, that or we can, like, say for example, we create our own thoughts. We can sit and we can daydream, we can imagine, we can think. So these are also absolutely separate from one another but merged into each other. So all of these things are very different. Now daydreaming would be very different from imagination. Imagination would be something that we create from our mind, that sometimes is not even reality. And we create it through our thoughts in our mind, imagining something or making a concept of something. But daydreaming would be that we would wish for something. We could sit down and wish that, oh, I would think that I want to achieve such and such, and let's say, for example, you would say, I want to get an A grade in my subject. So you would be sitting in class, like a teacher is giving a lecture, and you are not even paying attention to that, but you're lost in your thoughts. Thoughts could be happy and thoughts could be sad. So that, and they're all different, but they're merged with each other. All kinds of thinking involves thoughts. So whatever thoughts, all kind of thinking involves it. In reverie, it is free thinking, whereas in association and reasoning, thinking is controlled. Now, reverie, when we are, that means that we are not thinking on a specific topic or a specific thing, but we are just taking the whole situation in hand and thinking about just some things would be relevant and some irrelevant things. That would be when we aren't pinpointing exact thing that we want to come to a conclusion to. Now, daydream, where there is the least control of thoughts. So daydreams would be association and reasoning, thinking is controlled. The way we control our thinking would be how we reason about things. Now, if we want to come to a conclusion, I would say that, okay, maybe if I go and miss my class, let's say, for example, I would say, okay, I would have some free time, or I could rest a little bit more. But then again, then I would think that no, if I miss it, then it would be a huge loss for me. So that would be reasoning. That way of thinking would be called reasoning. Now, the differences lie in the process of pleasant daydream, where there is the least control of thoughts. So that's now the difference, where free thinking, or thinking that is controlled in association and reasoning, controlled in the way that we would control those thoughts. We would know what we are thinking about, what we are going to be discussing about, or what I am going to further discuss. Those are all the things, thinking processes that are going in my mind. But the difference would be in daydream. Now, that's where we have the least control. We would just be lost in our thoughts, thinking and imagining different situations and things, without even realizing that we are not particularly thinking about a particular point. Now, the flow of thoughts in reverie is unchecked. So the flow of thought, there are constant flow of thoughts, like constantly, even till the time, from the time we awake in the morning to the time that we go to bed, our mind is constantly processing thought. In reverie, it's unchecked. There is no check or no limit to the way or the flow of how many thoughts would be going through our mind. On the other hand, now in association and reasoning, the thoughts are highly controlled. So in one way, in reverie, we would say that there is no limit. But on the other hand, if we are in association or in reasoning, then we are controlling those thoughts. Now, reverie and reasoning are two extremely opposite ends. Reverie would be completely when we are not thinking about anything particular, but the thoughts are flowing through our mind. And reasoning would be something which, when we know exactly what we want and we want to find a solution or a conclusion to our thoughts. Now, between the two extreme ends, there are other types of thinking also. Now, these are the two types that we would say that would be the plus and the minus, reverie and reasoning. So, but there are other types also. Now, thinking can also be differentiated on the basis of the degree to which a thought is faithful reproduction of the past experience. So we can also differentiate or find a difference in the basis of the degree or level to which a thought is a faithful reproduction. Would be something that when we are reproducing, like we've had a past experience or we've experienced something, and we are reproducing that thought into our mind. Or let's say, like for example, replaying. You do that in your audio cassettes or in your videos also. You can rewind a certain scene. When you rewind a certain scene, you go back from one stage to another stage of a movie. Now, the same thing you can do with your mind. In the morning, let's say for example, you've gone out, you've spent a hectic day in the morning, and you come back in the evening to your home, and then you think over what all the things that you have achieved or you've done in that day. So that would be you would be reproducing in your thought the experiences that you have faced in that day, in the morning, which would be considered as a past experience, something that has already happened with you. So how you would reproduce that would be differentiated also. Now, one extreme, on one extreme there are thoughts which are very faithful reproductions of the past experiences, in which we include recollections or memories of the past. So some point we reproduce the faithful thoughts and sometimes of past experiences, and sometimes there are recollections and memories. So long ago I would remember that, yes, I even have childhood memories. So you yourself, if you think back, you would think about childhood memories and maybe recollect something, recollections of your past or of your childhood, that maybe today you would tell to your friends stories of your childhood and they would laugh. Some funny story, some maybe sad event or anything special, something you did, you maybe got good grades in a class, or you were appreciated in a certain way for conducting an act, or you were maybe punished from your parents if you were very naughty in your childhood. So, or recollections, so those are your memories and recollections. So one extreme would be that we reproduce those thoughts and those memories come back to us, or recollections come back to us. It is the idea formed in mind based on pictures of concrete objects and experiences, imagination and planning. So these basically are the ideas formed in our mind on the specific pictures, let's say, of concrete objects or experiences. Concrete objects like something that is solid, that we can recollect and say, for example, let's say from your childhood you remember a doll that you have played with, or a little toy object or a car. So those would be concrete objects or experiences, or some experience that you've had in your past, or something that you've imagined or you've planned. You base those on mental pictures, images in your mind. You can remember people's faces by that. Sometimes maybe you can forget the person's name, but you would remember the face, that, oh, I've seen this person somewhere. So that would be based on your mind, a picture or an image. So it is formed through perception, which is the mental apprehension of past events, which are perfect reproductions. So formed through perception, how we perceive things, or how we would understand or take them into the, which is the mental apprehension of past events. So that would be how we would mentally recollect the thoughts and go back to recollection of past events, which would be perfect representations or reproductions of whatever we want to remember or perceive. Now on the other extreme, that would be one extreme, when we are recollecting those images or those thoughts. Now on the other extreme we have imaginative recall. Now there is the category of recall which cannot be based on actual fact. So imaginative recall would be, we cannot completely base that on fact and say that that is reality. Sometimes we think of something, that certain such act has happened, but we are not exactly sure if it exactly happened in that way. So that would be imaginative recall. And it's not a must that that recall has to be based on an actual fact or on an actual event. Now, the concept which is related to thinking is one of the important parts of psycholinguistics, of an object as understood through the senses. So concept which is related to thinking would be that an object as understood through the senses is how we understand an object. Let's say, for example, we have, let's say on this table we have a pen. So this is an object that I would understand through my senses. Now my senses tells me this is a pen. So that's how I would think about it. That is how I would relate to it. I would see a pen anywhere line anywhere, and I would definitely know that that is a pen. That's how we relate to things and objects. The mind has the property of forming generalized images from the individual images and combining them to what is common to all. So sometimes your mind has a huge quality, and I think a mind of a person is the strongest part of a human being. So through your mind you could form generalized images from the individual images, and then maybe you could like take individual images and you could make a general sort of view about it, or image that you could think about, and then you would combine them to what is common to all. So whatever ideas or concepts are formed in the mind, we realize them through language. So whatever ideas comes to our mind, whatever concepts come to our mind, or whatever things we think about, we realize them through language, or we deliver them to the other person or to the world through our language, by expressing it through language. Now in the process of thinking, the language is not exposed to communicate it to others. So in the process of thinking, when we are thinking about something, those thoughts are going within our mind. Nobody can read our mind, nobody can tell us what I'm thinking. Like कोई भी आपका दिमाग पढ़ के नहीं कह सकता कि आप अभी क्या सोच रहे हैं. But वही आप जब तक उन thoughts को words में ना लेके आओ, जब आप उनको words में लेके आओगे तो आप वो language में आप express करोगे, ठीक है, चाहे वो sign language हो, चाहे वो written language हो, चाहे वो spoken language हो. जब आप language में अपनी thoughts को, अपनी सोच को express करोगे, उस वक़्त आप उसको expose करते हो दूसरों के लिए, सामने दूसरों से communicate करने के लिए या उनसे बातचीत करने के लिए. So you can only bring your thoughts and the way you are imagining things, you could only express to others through language. Now it could be any type of language. It could be spoken language, it could be, like I said, written language, but we express our thoughts, whatever we are thinking. Now it remains in the state of undelivered feelings in our mind. Most of the time, there are undelivered feelings in our mind. It would remain like that there are so many things that are going through our mind. The thoughts are expressed in a certain situation before the right participants. So we could be thinking about different feelings or different things. Let's say, for example, I am angry at a friend of mine, or let's say if you are angry at a fellow student of yours. Now, you would be thinking about it all day long. I'm going to go to college or university and I'm going to go and discuss, why did he do such and such? Why did he offend me in such a way? So those are the thoughts that are going in your mind. Now, those are the thoughts that you express in a certain situation. And you would do it in front of the right participants. Now you would, if you're angry at a particular person, you wouldn't be going and screaming at the whole class. You would be in particular pointing out that person, and then you would go to that person and you would express your anger or your thoughts. So that would be how you have your undelivered feelings in your mind, but you deliver it to the right participants. So there are so many things going around in our mind all day long, but we know who we want to. Like, for example, I would say that I would sit and think that, okay, I have to go home and I have to talk to my sister, or I have to talk to my mother. And those are the thoughts that are going in my mind. Now, when I go home, when I act on those, I would choose that right participant. I wouldn't be discussing the things I want to talk to my mother with my sister. So your mind helps you differentiate that difference. Now these thoughts may be expressed in the form of general conversation, discussion, request, command, anger, surprise, taunt, pain, and pleasure through a particular language. Now all of these thoughts that are going in our mind, We could do it through general conversation. Like with general conversation, I could be coming to a colleague and saying that it's such a wonderful weather, or you could be going to your friend's home and you would just be talking about maybe a sports event or the weather, or maybe going to watch a movie. That would be your general conversation. Discussion, if you are discussing something in particular, a topic, and maybe you're requesting, maybe you want to take leave, for example, so you would request your teacher for a leave. A way of putting that or expressing that would be in different forms. Now, general conversation would be in a different form. A discussion would be in a serious, formal way. A request would be when you are trying to be nice and asking somebody for a favor. Command, when you are telling somebody that you have to do something. Like, for example, I would say to a student that please shut the door. Now, when I would say that, that would be that I am commanding. So there are so many thoughts that I can express and so many emotions I can express through language. Anger also, we show anger through whatever we feel at the moment. Surprise, once again. Taunt. Taunt का मतलब तंज है, किसी पे तंज करना. For example, so many kids do that. आप लोग बच्चे करते हो या आपस में एक दूसरे को आप taunt करोगे, ठीक है? Sometimes we create pain by that, or sometimes we create pleasure and everybody laughs on it. And all of that is done through particular language. And particular forms of language would be how we express in words our feelings. So all the above types of expressions of thoughts, of emotions, are the psychological evocation in the form of language, which we call psycholinguistics. So all of these expressions, these are all our emotions or expressions of thoughts, and they are all related to our psychological evocation, and they are put in the form of language. And all of this, when we put all of our thoughts and emotions into language, that would be called psycholinguistics. That would show the relation between both. Now, psycholinguistics, basically in language, language helps us to perform the following functions. Now, there are 4 functions. Now, we would say that when we are speaking in passing on our ideas to others, we pass on our ideas or our thoughts. Let's say, for example, I would say that, okay, today I would come to class and I would say that I'm going to give you let's say, a project that I want you to work on. So that would be my idea that I am passing to you. So in passing our ideas to others, a friend could be talking to another friend by saying, okay, maybe we should take a tour or a trip, or go out to the park, or go to an amusement park, or whatever. So that would be the idea of one person transferring his thoughts to the other through language. In concept formation, how we form the concepts of language. In analyzing a complex situation through simpler means. Now, we could be analyzing or judging or debating a complex situation, a difficult situation, and we would do it through more simpler means so we can understand it. That would be through language also. And through language we could in retaining abstract ideas. Now, further on, when we go on ahead, thinking about psycholinguistics and the relationship between language and mind. Now, all of this started that we have said that it's all psychological effects and the thoughts which we transfer into language. So now we're going to study further on about the relationship between the language and the mind. Now, H.G. Widdowson, in the year 1996, this is a sort of a reference. When you, in my slides, you will see names with references. Those references are through research papers or books that they have written or anything. You can search it on the internet and you can find related material to these people also, and related material discussing the same topic maybe. So H.D. Widdowson says in his book Linguistics that he's written a book by the name of Linguistics, and it is seen as a psychological phenomenon. So what his primary interest is what the form of language reveals about the human mind. So in his book Linguistics, he discusses, Mr. Widdowson discusses the primary interest of how a human mind works and what things that of a human mind that language can reveal. Now in the introduction of that book, we've already discussed most of it in the introduction also, and when he goes on discussing it in that book, he's discussing the relationship between language and mind. And we also have just previously in our previous slides we've discussed the relationship. So mind produces concept, and concept is realized by language. A mind would produce a concept or a thought about something, and that thought is realized or put into language. We express those thoughts from our mind through language. यानी हमारा माइंड, हमारा दिमाग कोई चीज़ को प्रोड्यूस करता है, कोई आइडिया या कोई कॉन्सेप्ट, ठीक है, और उस चीज़ को हम लैंग्वेज में डिलीवर करते हैं, लैंग्वेज में एक्सप्रेस करते हैं. So the image of concrete or an abstract thing is formed in the mind through perception or imagination, which is called conception. So कोई ऐसी concrete image या ऐसा कोई abstract thing जो है, जो हमारे mind में form हो जाता है, उसको हम perceive करते हैं या हम उसको अपनी imagination से use करते हैं, जो उसको हम conception call करेंगे. ठीक है, we'll call it conception because whatever we use or whatever is formed in our mind, हमारे mind में जो भी images या चीज़ें create होती हैं, we would call that conception. Now hence concepts are patterns. So पहली चीज़ तो हमने ये discuss कर ली कि conceptions हैं, ठीक है, thoughts. Now secondly what we want to discuss is that concepts are patterns, schemes or mental categories which enable us to interpret objects of our thoughts, whether perceptual or imaginative. So concepts ऐसे हैं, हमारे patterns हैं, ठीक है, दिमाग में पैटर्न बनते हैं, स्कीम्स बनती हैं, मेंटल कैटेगरीज हैं, ठीक है, which enable us to interpret objects of our thoughts, whether perceptual or imaginative. तो चाहे वो हम उनको imagine कर रहे हैं या हम उनको perceive कर रहे हैं, we can interpret those, we can explain those things, those objects through our thoughts, and they are to be brought as active cognitive disposition, direct and govern our apprehension. और ये जो है, they're brought as active disposition, and ये हमारी thoughts को govern करते हैं, हमारे apprehension को. Now the image of different things are formed in different ways in the minds of different people. So like I said, there are so many different things that a person could imagine. Now in many psychological tests, let's say for example, even in your IQ tests, many students or youngsters go through IQ tests also. In many experiments they have taken children or students or young people, and they have taken images or distorted images of different objects or figures, and then they ask you what this object would refer to you, or what would the concept be, or what would you imagine that this thing is. Let's say that they have taken a picture of a house and they have distorted it or divided it into different parts or onto a page, and they're asking you. Now some person, the way I would think would be very different from the other person. Now every person, every human being does not think in the same way. Everyone has a different way of understanding things, different way of perceiving things. So the mind is a very complex thing, like I said, and for every different person the mind would work in a different way. So I would maybe understand things in a different way than you would. My perception of the world would maybe be different from the way you perceive the world. Maybe I would be very fed up from the whole world and wouldn't enjoy working or living in this world, but maybe you would be a very happy person. So my perception would be very different. I would take things maybe very negatively, while you would be taking it very positively. So that would be the difference of minds. So even when you do have discussions with your friends, your fellow students, you can see that there is a difference. Everyone would have his own opinion or his own idea about a certain topic. That is the difference, how different people think and how their mind works. So the mind tries to analyze the objects and synthesizes the material that is common to all objects. So a mind would try to analyze the objects or try to understand the material and things that are very common to everyone. So we would differentiate, we would try to if we completely thought in different ways, and if we perceived everything in a different way, then we would be having so many clashes in our daily life. Like, for example, I gave you an example of a pen. Now if I say this is a pen, and if you say, no, this is a cup, that would be very weird, wouldn't it? That would create conflict. Now your concept of maybe a pen or a cup would be very different from my thought. So the mind, how your mind works, so to reduce these conflicts is to recognize these objects. So everybody would be saying that yes, this is a pen. And those would be the common objects that everybody can relate to. And the mind would analyze such objects and choose, let's say, for example, a table, a drape, or a wall. These are all examples of things that a mind would perceive and which would be common to all. Now, this procedure is called analytic synthetic process. Now, analytic synthetic process, this whole procedure of trying to analyze things and synthesize them would be analytical synthetic process. Now, generalization and differentiation play an important role in concept formation. Generalizing something and differentiation, like making a difference or finding a difference between things, they play an important role in the concept formation, how we form our concepts in our mind. A number of concepts combine together to form thoughts which are realized and expressed through language. So a number of concepts, we could form them together and we would realize and express them through our language. Now, for example, let's say I would create a situation for you that suppose someone loses something of importance to his life. कोई ऐसा बंदा कोई ऐसी चीज़ खो देता है जो उसकी लाइफ के लिए बहुत important है. As soon as he is informed of it, image of that thing forms in his mind and he realizes the importance of it. अब कोई एक चीज़ है, आपने कोई चीज़ खो दी, आपके लिए वो बहुत ज़्यादा इम्पोर्टेंट है. So आपको जब इन्फॉर्म किया जाता है कि आपकी फलां चीज़ गुम गई, ठीक है, let's say for example a diary. Okay, you've been writing all your lifelong daily routine and all your secrets, deepest secrets in that diary. And let's say, for example, somebody comes and tells you that, your diary is lost. Now you would immediately create an image in your mind of your diary. The picture will come to your mind, and then you would realize how important that was to you. तो आपका माइंड ऐसा काम करता है कि you can imagine, you can form an image of things and then suddenly realize how important or non-important that thing is. Now, then the loss creates immediately the feeling of distress in his mind, which is expressed in words. For example, everything is finished. Now, like I said, in distress, when you are under stress, you would say that suddenly when you are told that you have lost that, then your mind would create a feeling. You got the image, then suddenly you create a feeling of distress, of sadness, and you would express that feeling or that thought through your words by saying, like, for example, if that is everything to you in your life, you would say, everything is lost, yani sab kuch khatam ho gaya. The word shows your distress or how you feel. So this is a way, a structure of a sentence, how you would form and explain your thoughts. There are so many other ways. Now, if I would be angry, I would say that, oh God, everything is finished. So I would be showing that in anger. In happiness, I would say, everything is finished. That means that I'm showing happiness, that yes, I've lost it and I'm happy about it. So all of these ways, the expressions, and how you put and use those expressions in words, you can put them, you can show your feelings or your thoughts of your mind through your language. Now, for example, if he hears the news that his son has topped in the university, a person, let's say the same man, if he's shown that he's lost something, and then suddenly he gets the news also that his son has topped in the university, he's delighted. So he is very happy and suddenly comes up with the words of delight. So suddenly उसके mind में वो words of delight आ जाएंगे. अगर distress में होंगे तो distressful words आपके दिमाग में आएंगे. अगर खुशी के होंगे तो आपके वो delight और खुशी आपके लफ्ज़ों में आएगी. So he would suddenly say, excellent, my son, well done. So that would be praising the son. That would be showing your expressions, your thoughts through words. Now, if he is in anger, he loses control over his mind and speaks out what he should not. Same way, if he is angry, he would lose control and he would lose control over his mind and sometimes say something that he should not have. Like many times when we are angry, we do that. हम बहुत दफ़ा गुस्से में हम लोग बहुत कुछ अपने friends को कह जाते हैं and we think that, oh God, मुझे ऐसा नहीं कहना चाहिए था, ये हमें बाद में realize होता है. So that's how हमारा उस वक़्त हमारे mind पे हमारा anger कंट्रोल कर लेता है. लेकिन हम उस expression को भी words में देते हैं. So whatever words we would say, we would be hurting or cruel words that we would use in anger would be through language. Those are the thoughts going in our mind at that moment. So the activity of mind is always exposed through language. So आपकी जो भी mind में activity चल रही है वो आप हमेशा language के through ही expose करते हैं या उसको explain करते हैं. So whatever is going in our mind, we can express it, we can explain it, we could describe it through language. Hence the mind and the language are deeply interrelated. So नतीजा क्या निकला कि आपका जो mind है और language है वो interrelated है. They're joined. They are one and the same thing. So what we have studied today is that how language affects the mind and how we use language to express our thoughts that are going in our mind. So our basic point was trying to make you understand about psycholinguistics, the base of psycholinguistics, trying to make you understand the connection between psychological and linguistics. They're both theories, we combine them, and that's how. So how our mind works and how we express ourselves is all a study of psycholinguistics. So students, that is enough for this lecture today. Hopefully you have understood. I will not be giving you any quizzes or assignments at the moment, but I will gather them. What I would like you to do is to try to understand this material and try to experiment in your daily life in words and imagination and thoughts that you use and how you would put a thought through language. So always my advice to you would be that always think before you speak so that you don't hurt anyone's feelings. So that is a very good advice that everybody gives us. So inshallah then I will see you in the next lecture, and we will be further studying about psycholinguistics. Thank you so much. Goodbye.